They burned her with cigarettes, but froze when they saw she didn't flinch. The coffee machine hissed like an angry snake as Sarah Chen wiped down the counter for the 15th time that shift, her movements precise and economical despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. It was 2:30 a.m. at Midnight Grounds, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that made everything feel surreal and slightly dangerous. She had learned to find comfort in routine, in the predictable rhythm of brewing coffee and cleaning surfaces, because predictability meant safety, and safety was something she had once taken for granted. When Mike Rodriguez cornered her in the back office with a lit cigarette and that familiar predatory smile, demanding she work a double shift without overtime pay, she said no with the same calm tone she might use to decline cream in her coffee. When he pressed the burning tip against her forearm through her sleeve, watching her face for a reaction that never came, she didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even blink. She just stood there with eyes that had seen worse things than a small-time bully with a power complex could ever imagine. What Mike didn't know was that the woman he was trying to intimidate had survived interrogation techniques that would break most people in minutes, and the scars he was adding to her collection were nothing compared to the ones hidden beneath her long sleeves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been working at Midnight Grounds for exactly 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. She knew this because she marked each passing day on a calendar hidden in her studio apartment, counting down until she could disappear again and become someone else entirely. The job at the truck stop diner wasn't supposed to be permanent, just another temporary identity in a string of carefully constructed lives that kept her breathing and the people hunting her guessing. The night shift suited her perfectly. Fewer questions about her past, fewer coworkers to get curious about why she never talked about family or friends, fewer chances for someone to recognize her face from old newspaper photos or police files. She moved through her duties like a ghost, haunting familiar spaces, efficient and unremarkable, exactly the way she had been trained to blend into any environment. Most nights, the routine was simple enough. Truckers stopped in for coffee and conversation, late-night travelers grabbed energy drinks and snacks, and the occasional insomniac wandered in seeking human contact in the lonely hours before dawn. Sarah served them all with the same polite professionalism, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, her small talk practiced and forgettable. She had perfected the art of being present without being memorable, visible without being seen. The diner itself was a relic from another era. All red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting in ways that made everything look slightly unreal. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, the pie was homemade by Linda Harper during the day shift, and the atmosphere carried that particular mix of grease, caffeine, and diesel exhaust that defined American highway culture. It was the kind of place where stories were shared between strangers and then forgotten by morning, where people could be whoever they claimed to be, without too many questions. Sarah appreciated the anonymity of it all. During her previous life, when she still went by Detective Sarah Chen and wore a badge that meant something, she had spent countless hours in places like this, building relationships with informants and gathering intelligence on drug trafficking routes that stretched from Mexico to Canada. She knew how to read the subtle signs of criminal activity, could spot undercover operations from 3 tables away, and understood the delicate ecosystem of trust and suspicion that governed highway businesses. Now she was just another face behind the counter, pouring coffee and taking orders, her past buried beneath layers of carefully constructed normalcy. The other employees knew her as Quiet Sarah, the reliable one who never called in sick and always volunteered for the shifts nobody else wanted. They didn't know about the apartment she rented under a false name, the go bag hidden in her closet, or the way she checked for exit routes every time she entered a new building. Mike Rodriguez had been a problem from her first week on the job. He was the kind of man who mistook authority for leadership and used his position as night shift supervisor to compensate for every slight and rejection he had accumulated over 43 years of mediocre existence. His uniform shirt was always slightly too tight, stretched across a belly that spoke of too many beers and not enough physical activity, and he wore his supervisor badge like a general's star. From the beginning, he had singled her out for special attention. Extra cleaning duties when the shift was already understaffed, criticism of work that met every standard, and comments about her appearance that walked the fine line between inappropriate and actionable. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen it in police departments, military units, and corporate offices throughout her career. Men like Mike needed someone to feel superior to, and they gravitated toward women who seemed vulnerable or isolated. What Mike failed to understand was that Sarah's quietness wasn't vulnerability, it was control. Every measured response, every avoided confrontation, every moment of apparent submission was a conscious choice made by someone who understood that drawing attention meant exposing herself to dangers far greater than workplace harassment. She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, and she wasn't going to break that discipline for someone as small as Mike Rodriguez. Tyler Johnson had joined Mike's campaign of petty tyranny about 2 months into Sarah's employment. As the evening security guard, Tyler had authority over the parking lot and loading areas, which he exercised with the enthusiasm of someone who had never held real power before. He was younger than Mike, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of swagger that suggested military service that had ended poorly and grudges that had never been properly addressed. Together, Mike and Tyler had created an environment of casual cruelty that they probably thought was harmless fun. Comments about Sarah's appearance, questions about her social life that carried implied threats, and small acts of sabotage that made her job more difficult without quite crossing into actionable harassment. They seemed to take particular pleasure in cornering her during the dead hours of the night shift, when witnesses were scarce and management was non-existent. Sarah endured it all with the patience of someone who had survived far worse. She documented their behavior in a small notebook she kept hidden in her locker, not because she planned to report them, but because old habits died hard and intelligence gathering was encoded in her DNA. She noted patterns in their harassment, cataloged their escalating behavior, and maintained the kind of detailed records that had once helped her build cases against drug dealers and human traffickers. The truth was that Mike and Tyler represented the least of her concerns. Every day she worked at Midnight Grounds was another day she hadn't been found by the people who wanted her dead. Every quiet shift was a victory against odds that most people couldn't comprehend. Their petty cruelties were nothing compared to the sophisticated torture techniques she had endured during 18 hours of captivity in a cartel safe house 3 years ago. Those 18 hours had changed everything about who Sarah Chen thought she was and what she believed about human nature. She had entered that safe house as Detective Sarah Chen, confident in her training, and certain that her undercover work was making a difference in the fight against organized crime. She had emerged as someone else entirely, someone who understood that survival sometimes required becoming invisible, that strength could look like weakness, and that the most dangerous people often appeared harmless. The cigarette burns had started that night in the safe house, administered by professionals who understood that physical pain was just the beginning of breaking someone's will. They had wanted information about ongoing investigations, names of other undercover officers, details about prosecution strategies that could help their organization stay ahead of law enforcement. Sarah had given them nothing, not because she was particularly brave, but because she had learned early in her captivity that cooperation would only lead to more sophisticated forms of torture. So she had endured, hour after hour, burn after burn, question after question, until her captors began to suspect that she might be something other than a typical undercover detective. By the time backup arrived and extracted her from that nightmare, she had acquired scars that told a story of endurance that few people would ever understand. More importantly, she had learned that her capacity for silence under extreme pressure was far greater than she had ever imagined. The witness protection program had been presented as a temporary solution, a way to keep her safe while the prosecutions moved forward and the cartel leadership was neutralized. But temporary had stretched into permanent when it became clear that the organization she had infiltrated was more sophisticated and well-connected than anyone had realized. Her testimony had put away several mid-level operators, but the people who really mattered remained free and very motivated to ensure that Sarah Chen never testified again. So she had learned to disappear. New name, new social security number, new history carefully constructed by federal marshals who specialized in creating fictional lives for people who needed to escape their real ones. The woman who had once carried a badge and a gun became Sarah Chen, the night shift coffee shop employee, unremarkable and forgettable, just another face in the endless stream of people trying to make ends meet in small-town America. Working at Midnight Grounds had actually been her choice, not something assigned by her handlers. She had specifically requested a job that would keep her around people without requiring her to get close to anyone. The constant flow of customers meant that she was rarely alone, but the transient nature of truck stop clientele ensured that she wouldn't form relationships that could complicate her carefully constructed anonymity. Most of the regular customers were exactly what they appeared to be. Ray Martinez drove an 18-wheeler carrying electronics from Los Angeles to Denver and back again, stopping at Midnight Grounds twice a week for coffee that he claimed was the best on Highway 87. Jessica Kim was a college student who worked the afternoon shift and studied during slow periods, saving money for nursing school and dreaming of a future that didn't involve asking if customers wanted cream with their coffee. These were good people living ordinary lives, and Sarah envied them in ways they would never understand. She watched Jessica plan for a future that extended beyond the next 6 months, observed Ray's easy familiarity with other drivers and staff, and wondered what it felt like to exist in the world without constantly calculating escape routes and checking for surveillance. But she also knew that her presence put them at risk. Every day she remained in one place was another day that the people hunting her could narrow down her location. Every relationship she formed was another potential target they could use against her. The loneliness was intentional, a form of protection for both herself and anyone who might care about what happened to her. Mike and Tyler didn't know any of this, of course. They saw a quiet woman who seemed isolated and vulnerable, someone who might be hiding from an abusive relationship or running from debt collectors. Their Ravi, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harassment felt random to them, just recreational cruelty directed at someone who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. They had no idea that every insult they delivered was being compared to interrogation techniques designed by professionals, that every intimidation tactic they employed was being measured against memories of systematic torture. The night everything changed started like any other. Sarah arrived for her shift at 10 p.m., checked in with Linda Harper, who was finishing up the evening cleaning, and began the familiar routine of restocking supplies and preparing for the overnight crowd. The first few hours passed quietly, with the usual mix of tired truckers and late-night travelers passing through for caffeine and human contact. Mike arrived at midnight, as always, making his presence known with unnecessary noise and comments clearly designed to establish his authority over the night shift operation. He made his usual rounds, criticizing Sarah's coffee preparation technique and questioning whether she had properly cleaned the equipment, all while maintaining the tone of someone who was just trying to ensure quality standards. Tyler showed up an hour later, officially to handle a delivery of supplies but really to join Mike in whatever entertainment they could manufacture at Sarah's expense. She watched them conferring in low voices near the loading dock, their body language suggesting that they were planning something more elaborate than their usual harassment. Sarah continued her work with the same methodical precision that had characterized her approach to everything for the past 3 years. She cleaned surfaces that were already spotless, organized inventory that was already perfectly arranged, and served customers with the same polite efficiency that had made her nearly invisible to most people who encountered her. She was refilling the coffee filters when Mike approached her with an expression that she immediately recognized as dangerous. Not dangerous in the way that her former life had taught her to fear, but dangerous in the sense that someone with limited power was about to exercise it in ways that would reveal exactly who they really were beneath their carefully constructed facade of authority. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that preceded demands disguised as requests. "I need you to stay until 6 tomorrow morning. Jennifer called in sick for the morning shift, and Linda can't come in early." Sarah looked up from the coffee filters, meeting his gaze with the same neutral expression she had perfected over months of similar interactions. "I'm scheduled until 4. Working 14 hours straight violates the labor laws for this county." "Well, that's unfortunate," Mike replied, his smile taking on an edge that suggested he had been looking forward to this conversation. "But sometimes we all have to make sacrifices for the team. Unless you think you're too good for a little extra work?" The question was loaded with implications that both of them understood perfectly. Mike was establishing a test of her compliance, creating a situation where refusing his demand would provide justification for escalating his harassment. He was also doing it in front of Tyler, who had positioned himself near the back office door in a way that suggested this confrontation had been planned. Sarah could have agreed. It would have been easier, would have maintained the peace, would have avoided whatever Mike and Tyler had prepared for her if she chose to stand her ground. But she had learned during her months at Midnight Grounds that giving in to their demands only encouraged them to make larger ones. More importantly, she had learned during 18 hours in a cartel safehouse that sometimes the only way to maintain your humanity was to refuse to cooperate, even when cooperation might reduce immediate suffering. "No," she said simply, returning her attention to the coffee filters. "I'll work my scheduled shift. You'll need to find another solution for the morning coverage." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah could feel Mike's anger radiating across the small space between them, could sense Tyler shifting his weight in anticipation of whatever came next. She had crossed a line that Mike had drawn, and now he was going to teach her why that had been a mistake. "I think maybe you didn't hear me correctly," Mike said, his voice dropping to a tone that was probably meant to be threatening. "This isn't a request. This is me telling you what's going to happen. And if you have a problem with that, maybe you need to think about whether this job is really a good fit for your attitude." Sarah finished arranging the coffee filters and turned to face him fully. Her expression remained neutral, her posture relaxed, her hands visible and non-threatening. Everything about her body language suggested compliance, but her words carried a finality that surprised everyone in the room. "I understand what you're asking," she said quietly. "And I'm telling you that I won't be staying past my scheduled shift. If that creates a problem for staffing, that's a management issue, not an employee issue." Mike's face flushed red with the kind of anger that came from having his authority challenged by someone he had categorized as powerless. He took a step closer to Sarah, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate, his bulk towering over her smaller frame. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice carrying clearly across the diner. "I think you've gotten too comfortable here. I think you've forgotten that this is a job, not a charity. And maybe you need a reminder about who's in charge and what happens to people who don't want to be team players." Sarah didn't move, didn't step back, didn't show any sign that his proximity affected her. She had stood her ground against cartel interrogators who made Mike Rodriguez look like an angry child, had maintained her composure while professional torturers tried to break her will. A middle-aged diner supervisor having a power trip barely registered on the scale of threats she had survived. "I'm going to finish my shift," she said with the same quiet certainty. "And then I'm going home. If you have concerns about my performance or attitude, you can discuss them with Linda during regular business hours." That was when Mike decided that words weren't sufficient to make his point. That was when he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the cigarette lighter that would change everything about how Sarah Chen was perceived by everyone who witnessed what happened next. The small flame danced between Mike's fingers as he flicked the lighter open and closed with deliberate theatricality, the metallic clicking sound echoing through the empty diner like a countdown timer. Sarah watched the flame with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly curious phenomenon, her expression unchanged despite the obvious threat being presented. She had seen fire used as an instrument of persuasion before, had felt its bite against her skin when professionals applied it with clinical precision, and she knew that Mike Rodriguez was about to discover the difference between intimidation and actual torture. "You see this?" Mike said, holding the flame steady now, his voice taking on the tone of someone who believed he was delivering a masterclass in workplace authority. "This is what happens to people who think they're too good to follow simple instructions. This is what happens when you forget your place." Tyler moved closer from his position near the back office, his footsteps deliberate on the worn linoleum floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the whole scene feel like something from a low-budget crime drama. Through the large windows that faced the parking lot, the occasional headlight swept across the interior as late-night travelers passed by, unaware of the confrontation unfolding inside. Sarah could have ended this in multiple ways. Her training in hand-to-hand combat was extensive, her knowledge of pressure points and disabling techniques, refined through years of undercover work where violence was always a possibility. She could have had Mike on the ground and unconscious in under 3 seconds, could have neutralized Tyler before he understood what was happening, could have cleared the building and disappeared into the night before anyone thought to call for help. But violence would mean exposure. Violence would mean questions, investigations, police reports that might surface in databases monitored by people who wanted to finish what they had started in that cartel safehouse 3 years ago. Violence would mean the end of Sarah Chen, the coffee shop employee, and the beginning of a manhunt that would follow her until one side or the other stopped breathing. So she stood perfectly still and let Mike bring the flame closer to her forearm, watching his face as he searched for the fear that he expected to see. He was sweating slightly despite the air conditioning, his breathing elevated in the way that suggested he was working himself up to something he had never done before. This wasn't routine for him, wasn't part of his usual repertoire of workplace harassment. This was escalation driven by wounded pride and the need to reassert dominance in front of an audience. "Last chance," Mike said, the flame now inches from her sleeve. "You can apologize for your attitude, agree to work the double shift, and we can pretend this little conversation never happened. Or you can keep playing tough girl and find out what happens to people who don't respect authority." Sarah's response was so quiet that both men had to lean forward to hear it clearly. "Do what you think you need to do." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that Mike was too angry to process and Tyler was too inexperienced to understand. Sarah wasn't challenging him to hurt her, wasn't daring him to follow through on his threat. She was simply stating a fact about the situation they had created, acknowledging that his next action would reveal exactly who he was when he thought no one was watching. Mike pressed the flame against her sleeve, holding it there until the fabric began to smolder and then catch fire. The smell of burning cotton mixed with the ever-present aroma of coffee and grease, creating an olfactory signature that would linger in the diner for hours after the confrontation ended. Sarah felt the heat transfer through the material to her skin, felt the familiar sensation of tissue beginning to burn, and maintained the same neutral expression she had worn throughout the entire exchange. She didn't pull away, didn't cry out, didn't even blink as the flame ate through the fabric and began to sear the skin beneath. She just stood there, meeting Mike's gaze with eyes that had seen horrors he couldn't imagine, absorbing pain that professionals had once applied with scientific precision. The only sign that she was experiencing anything at all was the slight tightening around her eyes, a minimal response that somehow made her stillness more unsettling than screaming would have been. Mike held the flame against her arm for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds, waiting for the reaction that would validate his actions and confirm his authority. When no reaction came, when Sarah continued to stand there like a statue, absorbing punishment without acknowledgement, something shifted in his expression. Confusion replaced anger. Uncertainty crept into the spaces where confidence had been, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked like someone who was beginning to understand that he had made a serious mistake. Tyler stepped forward, perhaps sensing that his supervisor was losing control of the situation, or perhaps driven by curiosity about why someone would accept such treatment without fighting back. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded, staring at Sarah like she was some kind of alien creature. "Why aren't you screaming? Why aren't you begging him to stop?" Sarah turned her gaze to Tyler with the same calm attention she had given Mike, studying his face like she was memorizing details for a report she might file later. When she spoke, her voice carried no emotion whatsoever, just the flat delivery of someone stating obvious facts. "Because this isn't pain," she said simply. "This is just Tuesday night at midnight grounds." The response clearly wasn't what either man had expected. Mike lowered the lighter, the flame dying as he released the button. But his expression remained locked in confusion. Tyler backed up a step, his swagger evaporating as he processed the implications of what he had just witnessed. Through the kitchen pass-through window, Jessica Kim stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hands, her mouth slightly open as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Jessica had come in early for her shift, arriving through the back entrance while the confrontation was escalating in the main dining area. She was supposed to start at 3 a.m., but her ride had arrived early and she figured she could use the extra hours to help with morning prep. Now she found herself witnessing something that felt like a scene from a crime documentary, watching a coworker endure torture with the composure of someone who had experienced far worse. "Should I call the police?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the coffee machines. The question was directed to no one in particular, but it carried across the diner with the weight of someone who understood, that she was watching something that crossed every line of acceptable human behavior. Mike spun toward her voice, suddenly aware that his actions had been witnessed by someone whose opinion might actually matter. Jessica wasn't part of his night shift kingdom, wasn't subject to his authority, and was exactly the kind of young employee who might report workplace violence to people who could make his life very complicated. "This is none of your business," he snapped, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments earlier. "This is a disciplinary matter between management and staff. You need to go back to whatever you were doing and forget you saw anything." Jessica looked from Mike to Sarah, taking in the smoldering fabric on Sarah's sleeve and the complete absence of distress in her expression. Something about the scene didn't add up, something that made Jessica's instincts scream that she was looking at a situation far more complex than workplace harassment. "Ma'am," Jessica said, addressing Sarah directly, "are you okay? Do you need medical attention? Should I call someone?" Sarah turned toward the young woman with what might have been the first genuine expression she had shown all evening. Not quite a smile, but something warmer than the neutral mask she had maintained throughout Mike's assault. When she spoke, her voice carried a gentleness that hadn't been there when she was dealing with her tormentors. "I'm fine," she said, and somehow managed to make it sound convincing, despite the evidence burning on her sleeve. "But thank you for asking." Tyler was staring at the burned fabric, his face pale, as he began to process what he had participated in. "Mike," he said quietly, "maybe we should call this whole thing off. Maybe we should get her some first aid or something. This is getting way out of hand." But Mike seemed to interpret Tyler's hesitation as weakness, seemed to believe that backing down now would undermine whatever authority he thought he had established. Instead of de-escalating, he reached for Sarah's other arm, apparently intending to repeat the lesson on unmarked skin. "Not until she understands her place in this organization," he said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who had committed to a course of action and couldn't figure out how to retreat without losing face. "Not until she shows proper respect for management and agrees to work when she's needed." Sarah looked down at his hand gripping her forearm, then back up at his face with an expression that somehow managed to convey both pity and warning without including any emotion whatsoever. "You should let go of me now," she said quietly. There was something in her tone that made Tyler take another step backward, something that suggested consequences extending far beyond anything that had happened so far. Mike either didn't hear the warning or chose to ignore it, tightening his grip and raising the lighter toward her sleeve again. That was when the bell above the front door chimed, announcing the arrival of a customer who would change everything about the dynamic in the room. Ray Martinez pushed through the entrance with the tired shuffle of someone halfway through a cross-country haul, his trucker's cap slightly askew, and his thermos in hand for the coffee refill that had become routine during his twice-weekly stops at Midnight Grounds. Ray was in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of highway driving and the observational skills that kept long-haul truckers alive in a dangerous profession. He took in the scene immediately, his experienced eyes cataloging details that told a story of escalating violence and workplace abuse. "Evening, Sarah," he said with deliberate normalcy, as if walking into the middle of an assault was just another part of his Tuesday night routine. "Got any of that Colombian blend left? Or am I stuck with the regular tonight?" His question was directed to Sarah, but his attention was clearly focused on Mike and Tyler, both of whom were suddenly aware that their private disciplinary session had acquired an audience with the ability to make their lives very complicated. Ray Martinez wasn't just another customer. He was a regular who knew the staff, who would be missed if something happened to him, and who had the kind of presence that suggested he wouldn't be easily intimidated. Mike released Sarah's arm but didn't step away, his body language suggesting someone who was trying to maintain authority in a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his control. "We're handling some internal business here," he announced to Ray. "Maybe you could come back in a few minutes when we're done." Ray set his thermos on the counter with deliberate care, his movements slow and non-threatening but somehow conveying the impression of someone who was prepared for whatever came next. "Well, that's interesting," he said, his voice carrying the dry humor of someone who had seen enough human stupidity to fill several lifetimes. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like you just burned that young lady with a cigarette lighter. And I'm thinking that's probably not covered in any employee handbook I've ever seen." Tyler shifted nervously, glancing between Mike and Ray like he was trying to calculate odds in a situation that had too many variables. "Sir, this really isn't your concern," This is between management and staff, and we'd appreciate it if you'd just let us handle our business." Ray's laugh was short and completely without humor. "Son, I've been driving these highways for 30 years, and I've seen every kind of human stupidity you can imagine. But I've never seen a grown man torture a woman in a coffee shop and call it management. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to step away from that lady, you're going to put that lighter down, and we're all going to have a nice calm conversation about how this situation is going to end." The room filled with the kind of tension that preceded either violence or surrender, with everyone present understanding that the next few moments would determine whether this incident escalated into something that would require police reports and hospital visits, or de-escalated into the kind of workplace incident that could be resolved with apologies and promises of better behavior. Sarah remained perfectly still throughout the exchange, watching the dynamics play out with the detached interest of someone who understood that the situation was evolving beyond her immediate control. She could see Jessica behind the counter, phone in hand, clearly debating whether to call for help. She could see Ray positioning himself between her and the two men who had been tormenting her, his body language suggesting military or law enforcement training. Most importantly, she could see Mike's growing desperation as he realized that his attempt to assert dominance had created a situation with no good exit strategy. "This is ridiculous," Mike announced, his voice carrying the forced bravado of someone who is trying to convince himself as much as his audience. "I'm the supervisor here. I have the authority to discipline employees who won't follow instructions. And I don't need permission from some trucker who doesn't understand how businesses operate." Ray nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Mike's argument with genuine interest. "You know what?" he said finally. "You're absolutely right. You do have authority over your employees. But what you don't have is the authority to commit assault and battery in front of witnesses. What you don't have is the right to torture people because they won't work overtime. And what you definitely don't have is the protection you're going to need when the police arrive." Jessica's voice cut through the tension from behind the counter. "I already called them," she announced quietly. "They should be here in about 5 minutes." The silence that followed was profound enough that everyone could hear the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of trucks passing on the highway. Mike's face went through several color changes as he processed the implications of Jessica's announcement, while Tyler looked like someone who was trying to figure out how he had ended up as an accessory to a crime he hadn't intended to commit. Sarah finally moved, reaching up to examine the burned fabric on her sleeve with the clinical interest of someone assessing damage to equipment rather than injury to flesh. The movement was small, but it broke the spell that had held everyone frozen, and suddenly the room was full of motion and voices as people began to understand that this situation was about to become official. "Wait," Tyler said, his voice carrying a note of panic. "Wait, maybe we can work this out without involving the police. Maybe we can just call this a misunderstanding, and everyone can go back to their jobs." Ray's expression suggested what he thought of that idea. "Son, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. That lady there just absorbed torture that would have most people screaming for their mothers, and she did it without even changing expression. That's not normal. That's not something people learn in customer service training. That's something people learn in very specific, very dangerous circumstances." He turned his attention to Sarah, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Ma'am, I don't know what your story is, and I'm not going to ask questions that might make your life more complicated. But I've seen enough to know that whatever Mike here thought he was doing, he just made a mistake that's going to follow him for the rest of his life." Sarah met Ray's gaze with something approaching gratitude, recognizing in him the kind of person who understood that some situations were more complex than they appeared on the surface. When she spoke, her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there during her interactions with Mike and Tyler. "Thank you," she said simply, "but you don't need to get involved in this. I can handle whatever comes next." Ray's smile was grim but genuine. "I'm sure you can, ma'am. But sometimes it's nice to have witnesses who can testify that you handled it with more class than the situation deserved." Through the windows, red and blue lights began to paint the parking lot in alternating colors, announcing the arrival of law enforcement and the end of Mike Rodriguez's career as a supervisor at Midnight Grounds. But what none of them knew yet was that the police officer walking through the front door was about to recognize something in Sarah Chen's composure that would change everything about how this incident was understood and resolved. Detective Amanda Torres had been a cop for 15 years, long enough to develop instincts about people and situations that went beyond what appeared on the surface. She walked into Midnight Grounds expecting to find a routine workplace assault, maybe domestic violence that had spilled into a public space, certainly nothing that would require more than statements and arrests. Instead, she found herself looking at a scene that triggered every investigative instinct she had developed over a decade and a half of police work. A woman standing calmly beside a coffee counter, her sleeve burned and her skin probably injured, showing no signs of distress or trauma. Two men who looked like they had been caught doing something they knew was wrong, radiating guilt and panic in equal measure. And an older man who carried himself like someone with law enforcement or military experience, positioned protectively but not aggressively. Detective Torres had seen torture victims before, had interviewed survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking and organized crime. She knew what trauma looked like, understood the psychological profiles of people who had endured systematic abuse. What she was looking at didn't fit any of those patterns. Sarah Chen stood like someone who had absorbed violence and processed it through systems that most people didn't possess. Her composure wasn't shock or denial, or the kind of dissociation that trauma victims often exhibited. It was the controlled calm of someone who had been trained to endure pain and maintain operational effectiveness regardless of circumstances. "I'm Detective Torres," she announced to the room in general. "Someone called about an assault. Who wants to tell me what happened here?" Jessica stepped forward first, her hands shaking slightly as she pointed toward Mike, who was still holding the lighter-like evidence of his own guilt. "That man burned her with a cigarette lighter because she wouldn't work a double shift," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I saw the whole thing. He held the flame against her arm for like 15 seconds, and she just stood there, like it wasn't even happening." Detective Torres turned her attention to Sarah, studying her face with the intensity of someone who had spent years learning to read people in crisis situations. What she saw defied every pattern she had encountered in 15 years of police work. Sarah's breathing was steady, her posture relaxed, her expression carrying the kind of neutral professionalism that Torres associated with fellow law enforcement officers giving testimony in court. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see that burn," Torres said gently, her tone carrying the careful respect she used with victims who might be in shock. "And I'll need to ask you some questions about what happened here tonight." Sarah extended her arm without hesitation, rolling up the damaged sleeve to reveal skin that was already beginning to blister from the deliberate application of heat. The burn was severe enough to require medical attention, painful enough that most people would be seeking immediate relief, but Sarah examined it with the detached interest of someone assessing minor equipment damage. "The injury is superficial," she said, in the same calm tone she might use to report a coffee machine malfunction. "Second-degree burns across approximately 2 inches of surface area. It will heal without requiring professional medical intervention." Torres blinked, processing both the clinical accuracy of Sarah's self-assessment and the complete absence of emotional response to what should have been traumatic injury. "Ma'am, that's a serious burn. You should really let the paramedics take a look at that when they arrive." "Paramedics won't be necessary," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a finality that suggested the topic was closed. "I've had worse injuries that healed properly with basic first aid. This doesn't require emergency medical attention." Ray Martinez had been watching the exchange with growing fascination, his experienced eyes cataloging details that told a story far more complex than workplace harassment. "Detective," he said quietly, "I think you might want to ask this lady about her background. Because normal people don't assess their own torture injuries like they're filling out an incident report." Mike seemed to interpret Ray's comment as support for his version of events, stepping forward with renewed confidence. "Exactly," he said, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of someone who believed he was being unfairly persecuted. "There's something seriously wrong with her. Normal people don't just stand there and take it when someone's trying to teach them a lesson about respect and authority." Detective Torres turned her attention to Mike with the expression of someone who had just heard a confession disguised as a defense. "So you're admitting that you intentionally burned her with a cigarette lighter?" The question hung in the air while Mike's brain caught up with his mouth, his face cycling through several expressions as he realized that his attempt to justify his actions had instead provided clear evidence of criminal intent. Tyler backed further away from his supervisor, his body language suggesting someone who was trying to distance himself from a situation that was spiraling toward disaster. I was enforcing workplace discipline, Mike stammered, his voice losing the confidence it had carried moments earlier. She was being insubordinate, refusing to follow direct orders from management. Sometimes you have to make examples of people who think they're above the rules. Torres pulled out her notebook with movements that suggested she had heard enough to begin formal documentation. Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the victim and place your hands where I can see them. You're under arrest for assault in the second degree, and possibly aggravated assault, depending on the severity of the victim's injuries. Wait, Tyler interrupted, his voice cracking with the stress of watching his supervisor dig himself deeper into legal trouble. Detective, there's something you need to understand about what happened here. This wasn't normal. The way she reacted, it wasn't human. Nobody just stands there and takes that kind of pain without even flinching. Torres looked back at Sarah, who was now wrapping her injured arm with napkins from the dispenser, with the efficient movements of someone who had treated similar injuries many times before. The detective's instincts were screaming that she was looking at something far more significant than a simple workplace assault. But she couldn't quite identify what was setting off her internal alarms. "Ma'am," Torres said, approaching Sarah with the careful respect she reserved for situations she didn't fully understand. "I'm going to need to take a detailed statement about what happened here tonight. But first I need to ask you something that might seem unusual. Have you ever received training in pain tolerance or resistance to interrogation?" The question fell into the diner like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of silence that spread to every corner of the room. Sarah's hands paused in their careful wrapping of her injury, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not surprise, but the kind of careful consideration that preceded important decisions. "Why would you ask that?" Sarah's voice remained neutral, but there was a new quality to it that suggested Detective Torres had stepped closer to something significant. Torres had spent enough time interviewing people with specialized backgrounds to recognize the signs. "Because I've seen torture victims, and I've seen people trained to resist torture. The way you handled what just happened, the way you assessed your own injuries, the complete absence of emotional response to deliberate infliction of pain, that's not trauma response. That's professional conditioning." Ray Martinez moved closer to the conversation, his curiosity overriding his intention to remain a neutral witness. "Detective, I drove trucks through some rough territory overseas before I started domestic routes. I've seen military contractors, intelligence operatives, people trained for situations most of us can't imagine. And this lady here has that same kind of calm under pressure that you only get from very specific, very intense training." Jessica remained behind the counter, but her attention was completely focused on the conversation unfolding in front of her. "I've been working here for 8 months, she said quietly. "And Sarah's always been different. Not weird different, just composed different. Like nothing ever rattles her, nothing ever surprises her. Even during the busiest shifts or when customers get really difficult, she handles everything with the same level of professional calm." Detective Torres studied Sarah's face, looking for tells that might indicate deception or evasion. What she found instead was someone making calculations, weighing options, considering consequences with the methodical approach of someone who had learned that hasty decisions could have life-or-death implications. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that anything you tell me will be part of an official police report," Torres said carefully. "If there are aspects of your background that you prefer to keep private, I respect that. But if there are circumstances that might help me understand what happened here tonight, it could be important for how this case proceeds." Sarah finished wrapping her arm and looked around the diner, taking in the faces of people who had witnessed her endure torture with inhuman composure. She could see the questions in their eyes, the curiosity about what kind of person could absorb deliberate pain without reaction. She could also see something else. Respect from Ray, protective concern from Jessica, and professional recognition from Detective Torres. For 3 years, she had maintained perfect anonymity, had successfully convinced everyone around her that she was exactly what she appeared to be. But Mike Rodriguez's sadistic impulses had shattered that carefully constructed facade, had forced her to reveal capabilities that normal people didn't possess. Now she faced a choice between maintaining her cover and trusting law enforcement with information that could get her killed. "Detective," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that couldn't be unmade, "there are aspects of my background that are classified at levels above local law enforcement clearance. What I can tell you is that my reaction to pain is the result of specialized training received during previous employment with federal agencies. The admission fell into the room like a controlled detonation, rearranging everyone's understanding of what they had witnessed. Mike's face went pale as he began to process the implications of having tortured someone with federal law enforcement background. Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, his earlier bravado replaced by the growing realization that he had participated in assaulting someone who might have the resources to make his life very complicated. Detective Torres felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in her mind. Federal agencies, she repeated carefully. Are we talking about training that would involve resistance to interrogation techniques? Sarah met her gaze with eyes that held depths of experience that Torres was only beginning to understand. Among other specializations, yes. The specific details are classified, but I can confirm that pain tolerance and psychological resistance were components of my professional preparation. Ray Martinez let out a low whistle, his expression mixing admiration with concern. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of federal work requires that level of conditioning? Because I've met folks from various agencies over the years, and most of them don't go through anything that intensive. The kind of work where capture means torture. Sarah replied simply. The kind of assignments where your ability to resist interrogation can mean the difference between operational success and the deaths of other operatives. The kind of job where you learn that pain is temporary, but compromised missions can have consequences that last for decades. Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper when she asked, "Is that why you always seem so calm during the difficult shifts?" Because compared to whatever training you went through, dealing with angry customers isn't actually stressful? Sarah's smile was slight but genuine, the first real expression of warmth she had shown all evening. Something like that. When you've been through systematic conditioning designed to break your will, and you've successfully resisted it, most civilian challenges feel relatively manageable. Detective Torres was rapidly revising her understanding of the incident, realizing that what had appeared to be a simple workplace assault was actually something far more complex. Ma'am, I need to ask you directly, are you currently employed by a federal agency? Are you working undercover? Because if this incident has compromised an ongoing operation, there are protocols I need to follow. The question created another moment of profound silence as everyone waited for Sarah's response. Her answer would determine not just how the assault charges against Mike were handled, but potentially the safety and future of everyone in the room. Sarah understood the weight of the moment, understood that her next words would either maintain her carefully constructed anonymity or thrust her back into a world she had spent 3 years trying to escape. I am not currently employed by any federal agency, she said carefully, each word chosen with precision. However, my presence in this location is related to previous federal employment in ways that I cannot discuss without compromising ongoing investigations and the safety of other individuals. Torres nodded, recognizing the careful language of someone who was trying to provide helpful information without violating classification restrictions. Understood. Are you currently under any form of federal protection? Is your safety dependent on maintaining your current identity and location? Sarah hesitated for the first time since the interrogation began, and that hesitation told Torres everything she needed to know about the stakes involved. Detective, what I can tell you is that my safety and the safety of others depends on minimizing official documentation of my presence and capabilities. The incident tonight was unfortunate, but it cannot be allowed to compromise security protocols that extend far beyond this diner. Mike had been listening to the exchange with growing horror, finally understanding that his attempt to assert dominance over a quiet coffee shop employee had instead resulted in his assault of someone with connections to federal law enforcement and ongoing investigations. Wait, he said, his voice cracking with panic. I didn't know. Nobody told me she was some kind of federal agent. This was just supposed to be normal workplace discipline. Detective Torres turned to him with the expression of someone who had lost all patience with excuses. Sir, it doesn't matter what you thought her background was. Assault is assault, regardless of the victim's employment history. The fact that you chose to torture someone makes it aggravated assault, and the fact that you did it in front of witnesses makes it an open and shut case. Tyler stepped forward, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Detective, I need you to understand that I never touched her. I was just here when Mike lost his temper. I tried to get him to stop when things got out of hand. Ray Martinez's snort of derision carried clearly across the diner. "Son, I was watching the whole thing. You were encouraging him right up until you realized she wasn't going to break down and cry like you expected. You're just as guilty as he is. You just didn't have the nerve to actually hold the lighter." Torres was already reaching for her handcuffs when the front door chimed again, admitting another customer who would prove to be far more significant than anyone in the room could have anticipated. Officer Kevin Brooks walked through the entrance with the confident stride of someone responding to what he assumed was a routine disturbance call, his hand resting casually on his radio as he surveyed the scene. Brooks was young, probably in his mid-20s, with the eager professionalism of someone who hadn't been on the force long enough to become cynical about human nature. He took in the tableau quickly. Detective Torres with her notebook out, two men who looked like they were about to be arrested, a woman with obvious burn injuries who seemed remarkably calm about the whole situation, and an older man who carried himself like someone with law enforcement experience. "Detective Torres," he said with respectful acknowledgement, "dispatch said you might need backup for an assault case. How can I assist?" Torres looked up from her notes with the expression of someone dealing with a situation that was rapidly becoming more complex than she had anticipated. "Officer Brooks, I need you to take statements from the witnesses while I process the suspects. But first, I need to make some phone calls to determine proper jurisdiction for this case." Brooks nodded, pulling out his own notebook and approaching Ray Martinez. "Sir, I understand you witnessed the assault. Can you walk me through what you observed?" Ray's account was methodical and detailed, delivered with the precision of someone who understood the importance of accurate testimony. He described Mike's escalating harassment, the deliberate application of flame to Sarah's clothing and skin, her complete lack of response to what should have been excruciating pain, and his own intervention when the situation spiraled beyond workplace conflict into clear criminal assault. As Ray spoke, Brooks found himself glancing repeatedly at Sarah, trying to reconcile the quiet woman wrapping her own burn injuries with the description of someone who had absorbed torture without flinching. His law enforcement training included basic instruction about interviewing trauma victims, but nothing in his academy education had prepared him for someone who treated deliberate injury with the composure of a medical professional examining a minor cut. Jessica's statement corroborated Ray's account while adding details about the buildup to the confrontation, Mike's pattern of harassment towards Sarah, and her own growing suspicion that there was something unusual about Sarah's background. "She never talks about her past," Jessica explained to Officer Brooks, "never mentions family or friends or previous jobs. And she has this way of staying completely calm no matter what's happening around her that's just not normal for regular people." While Brooks collected witness statements, Detective Torres stepped outside to make the phone calls that would determine how this incident was officially handled. Sarah remained in the diner, finally accepting a bag of ice from Jessica for her burned arm, while maintaining the same professional composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the entire ordeal. Mike and Tyler sat in separate booths under Officer Brooks's supervision, both looking like men who had made decisions that would define the rest of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. Mike stared at his hands, probably replaying the confrontation and wondering how asserting workplace authority had escalated into federal implications. Tyler kept glancing at Sarah with a mixture of fear and fascination, trying to process what kind of person could endure deliberate torture with such inhuman calm. The diner felt suspended in time, fluorescent lights humming overhead while everyone waited for Detective Torres to return with information that would determine the next phase of this incident. Through the windows, the parking lot remained busy with late-night truck traffic, normal people going about their ordinary lives, while unaware that something extraordinary was unfolding in the coffee shop they were passing. Sarah sat quietly at the counter, ice pressed against her injured arm, watching the organized chaos of a police investigation unfold around her. For 3 years, she had successfully maintained anonymity, had convinced everyone she encountered that she was exactly what she appeared to be. Now that carefully constructed facade lay in ruins, destroyed by a small-time bully's need to assert dominance and her own inability to fake normal human responses to torture. But as she watched Detective Torres through the window, speaking urgently into her phone while gesturing toward the diner, Sarah realized that her exposure might not necessarily mean the end of her carefully constructed safety. Sometimes the truth, properly managed, could provide better protection than lies. Sometimes revealing controlled amounts of information to the right people could create allies rather than threats. When Torres walked back through the front door, her expression was grave, but not panicked. She approached Sarah with the careful respect of someone who had received information that changed everything about how this situation would be handled. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I've been in contact with federal authorities. There are some people who would like to speak with you about how to proceed with this incident in a way that protects both your safety and the integrity of ongoing investigations." Sarah nodded, unsurprised that her forced revelation had triggered protocols she had hoped never to encounter. "How long before they arrive?" "They're already en route," Torres replied. "Should be here within the hour. In the meantime, I need to secure the scene and ensure that everyone understands the sensitive nature of what they've witnessed tonight." The detective turned to address the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone delivering information that could not be ignored. "Ladies and gentlemen, this incident involves matters of federal security that extend beyond simple assault charges. Everyone present tonight will be required to sign confidentiality agreements, and any discussion of what you've witnessed could have serious legal consequences." The weight of that announcement settled over the diner like a heavy blanket, driving home the reality that a routine Tuesday night at Midnight Grounds had somehow become entangled with federal investigations and classified operations. But for Sarah Chen, it meant something different. It meant that her 3 years of anonymous existence were officially over, and whatever came next would determine whether she could find a new way to disappear or whether the people hunting her had finally found their target. The federal agents arrived with the quiet efficiency of people who specialized in containing situations that had already spiraled beyond local jurisdiction. Agent Monica Harrison stepped through the front door of Midnight Grounds at exactly 3:47 a.m., followed by Agent David Kim, both dressed in dark suits that somehow managed to look unremarkable despite screaming government authority to anyone who knew what to look for. They moved with the coordinated precision of partners who had worked together long enough to communicate through subtle gestures and shared glances. Agent Harrison was in her early 40s, with silver threading through dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested professionalism without vanity. Her eyes swept the diner with the systematic attention of someone trained to catalog details that might become important later, taking in the positions of witnesses, the evidence of the assault, and most importantly, the woman sitting calmly at the counter with ice pressed against a deliberate burn injury. Sarah recognized them immediately, not because she knew them personally, but because she had worked with enough federal agents to understand their particular brand of controlled authority. These weren't local FBI agents responding to a jurisdictional notification. These were specialists, probably from an agency that didn't advertise its existence, sent to manage a situation that involved someone whose background required careful handling. Detective Torres approached the agents with the respectful wariness of local law enforcement encountering federal oversight. "Agents Harrison and Kim, I presume?" "I'm Detective Torres, Bakersfield PD. I have 2 suspects in custody for aggravated assault, multiple witnesses, and a victim whose background has apparently triggered some kind of federal interest." Agent Harrison nodded acknowledgement, while Agent Kim positioned himself near the entrance, his presence effectively controlling access to the scene without appearing overtly threatening. "Detective Torres, thank you for your professionalism in handling this situation. We're here to assess the security implications and determine appropriate protocols for proceeding with the investigation." Her attention turned to Sarah, studying her with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile official records with the reality of a woman treating torture injuries like minor workplace accidents. "Ms. Chen, my name is Agent Harrison. I understand you've had a difficult evening." Sarah's response was immediate and telling in its precision. "Agent Harrison, Agent Kim, I assume your presence indicates that my operational security has been compromised beyond local containment. What's the assessment regarding continued viability of my current placement?" The exchange carried implications that sailed over the heads of most people in the room, but Detective Torres caught enough to understand that she was witnessing a conversation between professionals who shared knowledge that extended far beyond what had been revealed in her investigation. Ray Martinez and Jessica Kim watched with fascination, beginning to grasp that they had stumbled into something far more significant than workplace harassment. Agent Harrison's expression remained neutral, but there was a subtle shift in her posture that suggested Sarah's question had provided important information. "Ms. Chen, we need to conduct a full assessment before making any determinations about future protocols. In the meantime, we'll need to debrief all witnesses and ensure that this incident is properly contained." Mike Rodriguez had been sitting in stunned silence since the federal agents arrived, his mind struggling to process the reality that his workplace power trip had somehow attracted the attention of people who carried credentials that trumped local law enforcement. When Agent Kim approached his booth, Mike's face went through several color changes as he realized that his legal problems had just escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. "Mr. Rodriguez," Agent Kim said, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone delivering information rather than engaging in conversation. "You're going to be transferred to federal custody pending a full investigation into charges of assault against a protected individual. I need to inform you that the scope of this investigation extends beyond local criminal charges and may involve violations of federal statutes related to interference with ongoing operations." The words hit Mike like physical blows, each phrase driving home the reality that he had tortured someone whose safety was apparently a matter of national security. Tyler Johnson, sitting in the adjacent booth, looked like he was witnessing his entire future collapse in real time as he realized that his participation in the assault had made him an accessory to federal crimes he hadn't known existed. "I want a lawyer," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want a lawyer right now. I didn't know she was some kind of federal agent. Nobody told me there was anything special about her. This was just normal workplace discipline that got out of hand." Agent Harrison turned her attention to him with the expression of someone who had heard every possible excuse for criminal behavior and found none of them particularly interesting. "Mr. Rodriguez, you'll have access to legal representation as soon as you've been properly processed. In the meantime, I need you to understand that any discussion of what you've witnessed or participated in tonight could result in additional federal charges. Do you understand the importance of maintaining absolute silence about these events?" Mike nodded frantically, clearly terrified by implications he didn't fully understand, but smart enough to recognize as potentially life-altering. Tyler managed a similar nod, his face pale as he contemplated the possibility that grabbing a coffee shop employee's collar had somehow made him complicit in compromising federal operations. Jessica had been watching the federal takeover of her workplace with growing amazement, her notebook forgotten as she tried to process the revelation that her quiet coworker was someone important enough to warrant this level of government response. "Agent Harrison," she said tentatively, "are we in trouble for witnessing what happened? Because I just saw someone getting hurt and thought I should call for help." Agent Harrison's expression softened slightly as she addressed the young woman. "Miss Kim, you acted appropriately by calling for assistance when you witnessed an assault. However, you've now been exposed to information that falls under federal classification restrictions. We'll need you to sign some documents and participate in a brief debriefing, but you're not in any legal jeopardy." Ray Martinez had remained quietly observant throughout the federal intervention, his experienced eyes tracking the professional dynamics between Sarah and the agents. When Agent Kim approached him for his statement, Ray's account was precise and comprehensive, delivered with the clarity of someone who understood the importance of accurate testimony in complex legal situations. "Agent Kim," Ray said after completing his formal statement, "I've been driving these highways for 3 decades, and I've encountered all kinds of people in all kinds of situations. But I've never seen anyone handle deliberate torture with the kind of professional composure that lady displayed. Whatever training she received, whatever work she's done, it involved preparation for scenarios that most of us can't imagine." Agent Kim nodded, making notes that would become part of a classified file that few people would ever read. "Mr. Martinez, your observations are consistent with other aspects of this incident. We appreciate your cooperation and your discretion in ensuring that details of what you've witnessed remain confidential." While the agents collected statements and processed the crime scene, Sarah remained at the counter, her burned arm now properly bandaged with medical supplies from Agent Harrison's kit. She watched the organized chaos of federal evidence collection with the detached interest of someone who had participated in similar operations from the other side, understanding protocols that were invisible to civilian witnesses. Detective Torres approached her during a brief lull in the official activity. "Ma'am, I have to ask, how many other people like you are out there? How many folks are living quiet lives in small towns, carrying backgrounds that could turn a routine police call into a federal incident?" Sarah's smile was slight but genuine, carrying a hint of the person she might have been if circumstances had been different. "Detective, there are people all over this country who've served in ways that can't be publicly acknowledged, who've sacrificed things that can't be measured in traditional terms. Most of them managed to maintain their anonymity better than I did tonight. "What happens now?" Torres asked. "Do you disappear again? Do you get relocated somewhere else, where nobody knows what you're capable of?" "That depends on whether tonight's exposure has compromised my safety beyond acceptable parameters," Sarah replied. "There are protocols for situations like this, assessments that determine whether continued placement is viable or whether alternative arrangements need to be made." Agent Harrison rejoined the conversation, her expression suggesting that preliminary evaluations had been completed. "Ms. Chen, we've conducted initial security assessments and interviewed all witnesses. Based on current information, we believe that this incident can be contained without requiring immediate relocation, provided that certain protocols are implemented." The relief that flickered across Sarah's face was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that the prospect of another disappearance had been weighing on her more heavily than her composed exterior indicated. "What protocols are we discussing?" "Enhanced monitoring of local communications, periodic security checks, and modified operational guidelines for your current placement," Agent Harrison explained. "Additionally, we'll be implementing cover stories for tonight's incident that explain federal involvement without compromising classified aspects of your background." Jessica had been listening to the conversation with growing fascination and concern. "Does this mean Sarah can keep working here? Because honestly, she's the best employee we've had in years, and losing her would really impact our ability to maintain quality service during night shifts." Agent Kim exchanged glances with his partner before responding. "Miss Kim, that determination will depend on several factors that are still being evaluated. However, maintaining operational continuity is generally preferable when security parameters can be adequately managed." Ray Martinez finished his coffee and prepared to continue his cross-country haul, but paused to address Sarah directly. "Ma'am, whatever your story is, whatever brought you to this place, I want you to know that you handled tonight with more dignity and strength than most people could manage. If you decide to stay here, you'll have friends who respect what you've been through, even if we don't know the details." Sarah's response carried warmth that had been absent during her interactions with Mike and Tyler. "Thank you, Ray. That means more than you might realize." As the investigation continued, the true scope of Sarah's background began to emerge through careful questioning and controlled revelation. Agent Harrison's debriefing revealed that Sarah Chen had been Detective Sarah Chen, a specialist in deep undercover narcotics operations who had infiltrated organizations that most law enforcement agencies could only dream of penetrating. Her work had led to the dismantling of trafficking networks that stretched across multiple countries, resulting in arrests and prosecutions that had saved countless lives. The torture that had conditioned her to endure Mike's cigarette lighter without flinching had occurred during 18 hours of captivity in a cartel facility, where professional interrogators had applied techniques designed to break the strongest wills. Her survival and subsequent testimony had led to convictions that had crippled one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking organizations operating between Mexico and the United States. But those same convictions had made her a target for elimination by the remaining network leadership, people with resources and connections that made witness protection a necessity for her continued survival. For 3 years, she had successfully maintained anonymity in small communities, where her background allowed her to blend into ordinary life while staying alert for threats that might never materialize. Mike Rodriguez and Tyler Johnson were formally arrested and transferred to federal custody, where they would face charges that extended far beyond simple assault. Their attempt to intimidate someone they perceived as vulnerable had instead resulted in their prosecution for interfering with federal witness protection and compromising ongoing security operations. The coffee shop itself became the subject of enhanced security monitoring, with protocols established to ensure that Sarah's continued employment there wouldn't create additional risks for her safety or operational security. Linda Harper, the day manager, was briefed on general security concerns without being informed of specific details about Sarah's background, ensuring that workplace dynamics could continue normally while maintaining appropriate vigilance. Jessica Kim signed confidentiality agreements that she understood were backed by serious federal enforcement mechanisms, but she also received assurances that her cooperation and discretion were appreciated by people whose gratitude carried significant weight in government circles. Her quick thinking and calling for help had potentially prevented the situation from escalating into something far more dangerous. As dawn began to brighten the eastern horizon, the federal agents completed their initial assessment and began the process of implementing new security protocols. Sarah would remain at Midnight Grounds for the foreseeable future, her cover story adjusted to explain federal interest without revealing classified aspects of her background. The official record would show that she had been the victim of workplace assault by individuals who had unknowingly targeted someone under federal protection for unrelated civil rights violations. Agent Harrison approached Sarah for final consultation before departing. Ms. Chen, based on our assessment, continued placement appears viable with enhanced security measures. However, you should understand that tonight's incident has increased your visibility profile. If you experience any indication that your location has been compromised by hostile elements, immediate extraction protocols are available. Sarah nodded, understanding that her 3 years of successful anonymity had been disrupted, but not necessarily destroyed. Agent Harrison, I appreciate the professionalism with which this situation has been handled. If continued placement is viable, I'd prefer to maintain my current position rather than undergo another relocation cycle. Understood. We'll establish periodic check-in protocols and maintain monitoring systems to ensure that your security remains adequate. Additionally, local law enforcement has been briefed on general protective measures without being informed of classified details. Detective Torres had been observing the federal wrap-up of her investigation, learning more about witness protection and national security operations than she had ever expected to encounter in her career. As the agents prepared to leave, she approached Sarah for final conversation. Ma'am, I want you to know that what you survived tonight, both the assault and the exposure of your background, you handled with more courage than I've seen in 15 years of police work. Whatever you've been through in your past, whatever brought you to this place, you've earned the respect of everyone who witnessed your strength tonight. Sarah's smile was genuine and unguarded for the first time all evening. Detective Torres, thank you for your professionalism and your understanding. Having law enforcement officers who recognize the complexities of situations like this makes the difference between safety and exposure for people in my circumstances. As the federal agents departed and the crime scene was released back to normal operations, Sarah found herself facing the prospect of returning to work in an environment where her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered but not destroyed. The other employees would know that there was more to her story than coffee shop employment, but they would also understand that her background was protected by federal classification that made curiosity dangerous. Jessica began the process of cleaning up the diner and preparing for the morning shift change, her movements carrying the subdued energy of someone processing extraordinary events. Sarah, she said quietly, I don't know what your real story is, and I understand that I'm not supposed to ask questions. But I want you to know that whatever happens, you'll always have friends here who respect what you've been through. Sarah helped with the cleanup, her movements returning to the efficient routines that had characterized her work for 6 months. But there was something different in her posture now, a subtle relaxation that suggested the burden of maintaining complete secrecy had been partially lifted. She was still Sarah Chen, the coffee shop employee, but she was also someone whose strength and resilience had been witnessed and acknowledged by people who mattered. The sun was fully risen when the morning shift arrived to find Midnight Grounds operating normally, with no visible evidence of the federal investigation that had transformed a routine workplace assault into a matter of national security. Linda Harper received a briefing about enhanced security measures and new protocols for handling unusual incidents, but the specific details of Sarah's background remained classified above her clearance level. Ray Martinez continued his cross-country route, carrying memories of a night when he had witnessed something extraordinary, disguised as ordinary workplace harassment. His respect for the quiet woman who had endured torture without flinching would influence how he treated people for the rest of his driving career, understanding that strength and courage often wore unremarkable faces. As the day shift took over operations and life at Midnight Grounds returned to its normal rhythm, Sarah Chen began the process of adjusting to a new reality where her anonymity was compromised, but her safety remained protected. She had survived exposure without losing her placement, had endured torture without breaking her operational discipline, and had earned the respect of people whose good opinion would provide protection in ways that formal security measures could not. The cigarette burn on her arm would heal within weeks, leaving another scar to join the collection hidden beneath her sleeves. But the strength she had displayed in earning that scar, the composure that had transformed potential disaster into manageable incident, would remain as testimony to training and character that few people would ever fully understand. The weeks that followed the incident at Midnight Grounds settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and fundamentally different from Sarah's previous 3 years of careful anonymity. She continued her night shifts with the same methodical precision that had characterized her work since arriving in Bakersfield, but the atmosphere around her had changed in subtle ways that only someone with her training would notice. The other employees treated her with a new kind of respect that went beyond professional courtesy, an acknowledgement of strength that had been witnessed and could not be forgotten. Jessica had become something approaching a friend, which was a luxury Sarah hadn't allowed herself since entering witness protection. Their conversations during shift changes carried the easy familiarity of people who had shared extraordinary circumstances, though they both understood the boundaries that federal classification imposed on certain topics. Jessica never asked direct questions about Sarah's background, but she observed with growing admiration how Sarah handled every challenge with the same composed competence that had allowed her to endure torture without flinching. "You know," Jessica said one evening as they cleaned the coffee machines together, "I've been thinking about what happened that night with Mike and Tyler. Not the classified stuff, just the human part of it. The way you stayed so calm when anyone else would have been screaming or crying or begging them to stop. I keep wondering what it takes to develop that kind of inner strength." Sarah paused in her cleaning, considering how to respond to a question that touched on training she couldn't discuss and experiences she couldn't share. "Sometimes life puts you in situations where you learn that you're stronger than you thought possible," she said finally. "And once you discover that strength, once you know you can survive things that seemed impossible, everything else becomes manageable by comparison." The enhanced security protocols that Agent Harrison had implemented were invisible to most customers, but provided Sarah with reassurance that her safety was being actively monitored. Periodic check-ins with federal handlers occurred through carefully arranged meetings that appeared to be ordinary social interactions, and communication systems allowed her to report any concerns about potential threats or surveillance. The protection was comprehensive without being obvious, allowing her to maintain the appearance of normal life while ensuring that hostile elements couldn't approach undetected. Ray Martinez had become a regular fixture during his twice-weekly stops, his friendly conversation and obvious respect, creating an additional layer of informal security around Sarah's workplace. He never directly referenced the events of that Tuesday night, but his protective presence and keen observational skills provided early warning for any unusual activity in the diner's vicinity. Other truck drivers had begun to notice Ray's particular attention to Midnight Grounds, creating a network of informal watchers who didn't know why they were watching, but understood that Sarah was someone worth protecting. Linda Harper had adapted to the new security requirements with the pragmatic flexibility of someone who had managed highway businesses long enough to understand that some situations were more complex than they appeared. She implemented the recommended protocols without asking questions about their necessity, trusted that enhanced background checks for new employees were justified by circumstances she didn't need to understand, and maintained the kind of professional discretion that allowed classified operations to function within civilian environments. The coffee shop itself had become something of a sanctuary for Sarah, a place where she could exercise skills that had been developed for far more dangerous environments while serving people who appreciated competence without requiring explanations. The routine of preparing coffee and serving meals provided therapeutic repetition that helped process the stress of constant vigilance, while the social interactions allowed her to practice being human in ways that undercover work had never permitted. Detective Torres had become an occasional visitor during her late-night patrols, stopping in for coffee and conversation that never directly addressed classified topics, but conveyed ongoing professional respect and support. Their discussions ranged across law enforcement techniques, community safety concerns, and the challenges of maintaining public service careers in an increasingly complex world. Sarah appreciated having someone who understood the weight of carrying secrets while serving others, the difficulty of protecting people who would never know they needed protection. "I've been thinking about that night," Torres said during one of her visits, "about the different kinds of strength people develop based on their experiences. Military training teaches one kind of resilience, police work teaches another, and what you went through taught something that goes beyond either of those. It makes me wonder how many other people are out there, carrying that same kind of quiet strength while living ordinary lives." Sarah refilled Torres's coffee cup with movements that had become automatic over months of repetition. "More than you might expect," she replied carefully. "People who've served in ways that can't be publicly acknowledged, who've made sacrifices that can't be measured in conventional terms. They're teachers and mechanics and store clerks and office workers, blending into communities while carrying experiences that most people couldn't imagine." The healing process for her cigarette burn had progressed exactly as Sarah had predicted, the injury closing cleanly without complications and leaving a scar that joined the collection hidden beneath her sleeves. She treated the new mark with the same clinical detachment she applied to all reminders of her previous life, understanding that scars were simply evidence of survival, proof that she had endured pain and continued functioning despite attempts to break her will. Mike Rodriguez and Tyler Johnson had disappeared into the federal justice system, their prosecutions handled through channels that ensured maximum sentences while minimizing public attention to the circumstances of their crimes. Word had filtered back through law enforcement networks that both men were serving significant prison terms for assault on protected individuals, their cases serving as examples for anyone who might consider similar actions against people under federal protection. The broader implications of their punishment had created a deterrent effect that extended beyond their specific crimes, sending a message through criminal networks that certain individuals carried protection that made targeting them extraordinarily dangerous. Sarah understood that her exposure had actually enhanced her security in some ways, making her a known quantity to federal agencies, while simultaneously warning potential threats that she was not the vulnerable target she might appear to be. Agent Harrison maintained periodic contact through carefully orchestrated meetings that appeared to be chance encounters, their conversations covering security updates and threat assessments while maintaining the fiction of casual social interaction. These check-ins provided Sarah with confidence that her situation remained stable and that any changes in threat levels would be communicated immediately. "Your adaptation to modified security protocols has been exemplary," Harrison mentioned during one such meeting, her tone carrying professional approval that Sarah had learned to value. "The integration of enhanced monitoring with continued operational normalcy represents optimal management of your protection requirements." Sarah appreciated the validation while understanding that her success in adapting to new circumstances was built on skills developed through years of undercover work and survival training. "Agent Harrison, I want to express my gratitude for the professionalism with which this situation was handled. The ability to maintain my current placement while ensuring adequate security measures has allowed me to continue building the kind of life that makes long-term protection sustainable." The relationship between Sarah and her coworkers had evolved into something resembling genuine friendship, bounded by necessary discretion but enriched by mutual respect and shared experience. They understood that she carried knowledge they couldn't access and had survived experiences they couldn't imagine, but they also recognized her commitment to the work they shared and her investment in the success of their small highway business. Jessica had begun asking Sarah for advice about challenges that extended beyond coffee shop operations, recognizing that someone with her background might offer perspectives unavailable through conventional sources. These conversations allowed Sarah to share knowledge in ways that helped others while providing her with purpose that went beyond mere survival. "I've been thinking about applying for nursing school," Jessica mentioned one evening as they prepared the diner for the overnight rush. "But I'm worried about whether I have what it takes to handle the really difficult situations, the trauma cases, and emergency medicine where people's lives depend on staying calm under pressure." Sarah smiled, understanding that Jessica was asking about more than academic preparation. "The ability to remain composed during crisis situations can be developed through practice and proper training," she said. "But it also requires understanding that your emotional response to suffering doesn't determine your professional effectiveness. You can care deeply about people while maintaining the clarity needed to help them effectively." The advice carried weight that extended beyond its simple words, reflecting hard-won wisdom about managing emotional response during high-stress situations. Jessica recognized the depth of experience behind Sarah's guidance, understanding that she was receiving instruction from someone who had learned these lessons under circumstances far more demanding than anything nursing school would provide. Ray Martinez had become a mentor figure for other drivers who frequented midnight grounds, sharing observations about personal safety and situational awareness that reflected his growing understanding of security concerns. His influence helped create an environment where unusual activity would be noticed and reported, providing an additional layer of protection for Sarah while educating the broader community about recognizing potential threats. The thing about real strength, Ray explained to a group of younger drivers during one of his regular stops, is that it doesn't advertise itself. The people who've really been through something, who've really been tested, they don't need to prove anything to anybody. They just do their work and treat people with respect and handle whatever comes their way without making a big production out of it. His words carried particular weight for those who had witnessed Sarah's behavior during the assault, creating a standard of conduct that influenced how the entire community of regular customers approached conflict resolution and personal dignity. Sarah had become an example of grace under pressure without ever intending to serve as a role model, her natural behavior inspiring others to consider their own responses to adversity. The enhanced security monitoring had detected several attempts by unknown parties to gather information about Sarah's background and current location, confirming that the threats which had necessitated her placement in witness protection remained active. However, these probing efforts had been successfully deflected by the cover stories and misdirection protocols established after her exposure, demonstrating that managed revelation could be more effective than complete secrecy in certain circumstances. Agent Kim had explained during one of their briefings that Sarah's case had become a model for managing compromised witness security, showing how professional handling of exposure incidents could actually strengthen protection rather than necessitating expensive and disruptive relocations. Your situation has provided valuable lessons about the resilience of properly constructed cover identities, he noted. The ability to absorb limited exposure while maintaining operational effectiveness represents significant advancement in protection methodology. Sarah understood that her experience was being studied and refined to help other people in similar circumstances, giving her satisfaction that her ordeal had contributed to improving security for others who needed federal protection. The knowledge that her survival and adaptation had practical value beyond her own safety provided additional motivation for maintaining the careful balance between normal life and constant vigilance. The routine of night shift work had become genuinely comforting, providing structure and purpose that helped process the ongoing stress of living under assumed identity while remaining alert for threats that might never materialize. The familiar tasks of coffee preparation and customer service created therapeutic repetition that calmed her mind while keeping her hands busy, allowing her to maintain the appearance of ordinary employment while exercising skills that had been developed for far more dangerous purposes. Detective Torres had recommended Sarah for a civilian advisory position with the county sheriff's department, recognizing that her expertise in recognizing criminal behavior and managing crisis situations could benefit local law enforcement training programs. The position would allow her to contribute professional knowledge while maintaining her cover employment, creating additional layers of community integration that would enhance her long-term security. Your ability to read people and situations, to remain calm under extreme pressure, to make accurate assessments during crisis situations. These are skills that could significantly improve our training programs, Torres explained during their discussion of the opportunity. Obviously, any involvement would need to be carefully coordinated with your federal handlers, but the potential benefits for community safety are substantial. Sarah was intrigued by the possibility of using her background to help others while maintaining her current placement, understanding that increased integration with law enforcement systems could provide additional protection while allowing her to contribute meaningfully to public safety efforts. The advisory role would formalize relationships she had already developed, while creating official channels for sharing knowledge that could save lives. The proposal required extensive coordination with federal agencies, background checks that extended through multiple classification levels, and security assessments that ensured the advisory position wouldn't compromise ongoing protection protocols. Agent Harrison expressed cautious optimism about the arrangement, noting that increased community involvement often enhanced long-term security for protected individuals while providing them with purpose that made extended placement more sustainable. Jessica had been accepted into the nursing program at Bakersfield College, her application strengthened by recommendation letters from community members who had observed her performance during emergency situations. Sarah's mentorship had provided her with confidence to pursue healthcare career goals while understanding the emotional demands of serving others during their most vulnerable moments. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught me about staying calm when people are hurting," Jessica said during her final shift before beginning school. "Not just the technical advice, but the example you've set about treating everyone with dignity regardless of how they're behaving or what they're going through." Sarah felt genuine pride in Jessica's accomplishments, understanding that her influence had helped shape someone who would go on to serve others with competence and compassion. The relationship had provided her with the satisfaction of positive impact, while demonstrating that her experiences could be channeled into helping others develop strength and resilience. Ray Martinez had been invited to speak at trucking industry conferences about highway safety and community awareness, his presentations drawing on observations about personal security and situational awareness that reflected his growing understanding of threat recognition. His influence was helping create safer environments for highway businesses, while educating drivers about protecting vulnerable community members. The scars on Sarah's arms had settled into pale lines that were barely visible unless someone was specifically looking for them, physical reminders of survival that no longer carried the sharp emotional weight they once held. She had learned to view them as evidence of endurance rather than symbols of victimization, understanding that her ability to bear pain without breaking had protected not just herself but other people whose safety depended on her silence during interrogation. The night shift at Midnight Grounds had become a calling, rather than mere employment, providing her with community and purpose while allowing her to serve people who appreciated competence, without requiring explanations about its source. The work satisfied her need for routine and social interaction, while maintaining the flexibility required for someone whose safety depended on being able to disappear quickly if circumstances changed. Linda Harper had promoted Sarah to assistant night manager, recognizing her natural leadership abilities and her positive influence on workplace culture. The promotion carried additional responsibilities for training new employees and managing difficult situations, roles that allowed her to exercise supervisory skills, while contributing to the business success of people who had become genuinely important to her. Agent Harrison had indicated that Sarah's case was being considered for transition from active witness protection to inactive monitoring status, reflecting the success of enhanced security protocols and the stability of her current placement. The change would reduce federal oversight while maintaining emergency response capabilities, allowing her greater autonomy while ensuring that protection remained available if needed. Your adaptation to modified security requirements and your integration into the local community have exceeded all expectations, Harrison explained during their review meeting. The transition to inactive status would represent confidence in the sustainability of your current arrangements while maintaining our ability to provide enhanced protection if circumstances change. Sarah understood that inactive monitoring status would represent a significant milestone in her journey from active federal protection towards something approaching normal life, though she remained realistic about the ongoing need for vigilance and the permanent nature of certain security requirements. The prospect of reduced oversight was appealing while also carrying additional responsibility for managing her own safety through continued situational awareness and threat assessment. The coffee shop had become a gathering place for people who valued competence and reliability, drawing customers who appreciated the consistent quality of service and the calm professionalism that characterized its operations. Sarah's influence had helped create an environment where people felt safe to be themselves, where difficulties were handled with dignity, and where community formed naturally around shared respect for honest work and mutual consideration. Detective Torres had been promoted to detective sergeant, her successful handling of complex cases, including Sarah's incident, contributing to recognition of her investigative skills and her ability to manage sensitive situations requiring coordination with federal agencies. Their professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of the challenges involved in protecting others while maintaining necessary secrecy. The advisory position with the Sheriff's Department had been approved through all necessary channels, allowing Sarah to contribute expertise to training programs while maintaining her primary employment at Midnight Grounds. The arrangement provided her with additional purpose and community integration while creating formal relationships with local law enforcement that enhanced her overall security through increased visibility and support. As the months passed, and the anniversary of the cigarette-burning incident approached, Sarah reflected on the unexpected ways that exposure had strengthened rather than compromised her situation. The revelation of her background had created a network of protection and support that extended far beyond formal federal protocols, demonstrating that sometimes truth could provide better security than secrecy when properly managed by people who understood both the stakes and the necessary boundaries. The scars on her arms had become reminders not of vulnerability, but of strength, evidence that she had survived attempts to break her will and had emerged with her integrity intact. The pain she had endured had been transformed into wisdom that helped others develop resilience, proving that suffering could become service when channeled through people committed to protecting and strengthening their communities. Jessica graduated from her nursing program with honors, her clinical rotations demonstrating the calm competence and compassionate care that Sarah's mentorship had helped develop. She accepted a position in the emergency department of Kern Medical Center, where her ability to remain composed during crisis situations while treating patients with dignity would save lives and comfort families during their most difficult moments. Ray Martinez retired from long-haul trucking to establish a driver safety training company, his programs incorporating awareness techniques and community responsibility concepts that reflected his growing understanding of personal security and mutual protection. His influence was creating safer highways while building networks of informal watchers who looked out for vulnerable community members without understanding the full scope of their contribution to national security. The night shift at Midnight Grounds continued to operate with the smooth efficiency that had made it a model for highway businesses throughout the region, its reputation for quality service and professional management attracting customers who valued reliability and respect. Sarah's leadership had created a workplace culture that brought out the best in everyone, while maintaining the kind of operational security that allowed classified individuals to function effectively within civilian environments. Agent Harrison visited one final time to conduct the formal transition review that would move Sarah's case to inactive monitoring status, her assessment confirming that enhanced security protocols had successfully integrated with community relationships to create sustainable long-term protection. The meeting represented closure for an incident that had threatened to destroy 3 years of careful anonymity, but had instead strengthened the foundations of a new life built on controlled truth rather than complete secrecy. Your case has demonstrated that professional management of compromised security can actually enhance protection while providing protected individuals with more authentic community integration, Harrison noted in her final report. The success of these protocols will inform future management strategies for similar situations, potentially improving outcomes for other people requiring federal protection. Sarah understood that her experience would help others facing similar challenges, giving additional meaning to the difficult journey from active federal protection towards something approaching normal life. The knowledge that her survival and adaptation had practical value for protecting others provided satisfaction that extended beyond personal security, confirming that her service to others continued even after her formal law enforcement career had ended. The coffee shop had become home in ways that transcended employment or convenience, providing her with community and purpose while allowing her to contribute skills developed through years of dangerous service to the protection and comfort of ordinary people living honest lives. The transformation from anonymous survival to engaged citizenship represented hope that people could rebuild authentic lives even after experiencing trauma that changed them forever. As Sarah prepared for another night shift at Midnight Grounds, she reflected on the unexpected gift that Mike Rodriguez's cruelty had inadvertently provided. His attempt to break her will through torture had instead revealed strength that inspired others, created community bonds that enhanced her security, and demonstrated that some forms of power could never be taken away regardless of what people tried to do to you. The scars hidden beneath her sleeves had become symbols not of what had been done to her, but of what she had survived, evidence of endurance that allowed her to help others develop their own resilience while serving people who deserved protection from those who would harm the innocent. The pain she had absorbed had been transformed into strength that radiated outward, touching lives in ways that formal law enforcement work had never allowed. The cigarette burn that had started this chapter of her life had healed completely, leaving only the faintest mark to remind her of the night when attempted intimidation had revealed unbreakable strength. But the real healing had occurred in the relationships formed, and the community built around the recognition that some people carried burdens that made them more valuable rather than more vulnerable, more worthy of protection rather than more deserving of pain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.